This lesson is about inverses. Now we're going to start with a function and we're going to say that our objective is to find the inverse of that function. There really are three steps to do this. The first step is to take the function and just make it into y equals notation. Take the x and the y in that statement, swap them, have them swap places, and then solve for y, get it by itself. You really have to know though that sometimes the inverse that we find might not be itself a function. The idea is that an inverse is a rule. When you apply it to the range value of a function, it will produce the original domain value. So if I put in a domain value into a rule, I get out a range value, take that range value and put it into the inverse, that rule will produce the original domain value you started with, thus undoing what the rule did. That's why it's called the inverse, because it will undo what the original rule did for to the number. So let's use this as an example. Let's start with this one. F of x equals 3x plus 9. I'm going to use my steps here and just make it y equals 3x plus 9. I'm going to now swap the x and the y. I'm going to make it x equals 3y plus 9. Now solve for y. That means get it by itself. So I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. And now I'm going to divide by 3, and I get y equal to x minus 9 over 3. Now this only has one result as an answer. It itself is a function, so when we do get an inverse function, we use this notation with a little -1. That is the notation for an inverse function, equals x minus 9 over 3. Let's test it out. This is a one-to-one function. It's a linear equation, so its input produces one output. That output is only paired with one input. So we're going to try a number. Let's put in 2 here. Put in 2 and you get 3 times 2 is 6. 6 plus 9 is 15. Now let's put that result, 15, into this. 15 minus 9 gives me 6. 6 divided by 3 is equal to 2. The original domain value is now coming out of that inverse. Those two are inverses. This inverse rule will undo what this original rule did. All right, let's try it with this one. This one will end up not being, the inverse will not be a function. So let's start with our first step here. I'm going to make it y equals 4x squared minus 3. And now I'm going to swap the x and the y. X equals 4y squared minus 3. Let's get the y by itself. Add 3 to both sides. X plus 3 equals 4y squared. Divide both sides by 4. So y squared equals x plus 3 over 4. And now when I take the square root, notice you have to have a plus or minus there. That means it's not going to be itself a function because it produces two different answers. Plus or minus the square root of x plus 3, that quantity over 4. So this is the inverse. It has two values. Let's talk about what that means. So I'm going to just rewrite it here so we see it. Here's my inverse rule. So let's see what that means. Let's look back at our original. Let's do g of 10. If you put in 10 into this equation, you get 10 squared is equal to 100. 100 times 4 is 400. 400 minus 3 is equal to 397. If you do g of -10, -10 squared is also positive 100. 100 times 4 is 400, minus 3 is also 397. Notice that means that when you put in two different inputs, you get out the same output. Still a function, but that means that you're going to not have a one-to-one function here. So what that means is if you have 397 here and you put it into the inverse, 397 plus 3 is 400. 400 divided by 4 is 100. Take the square root of that, you get 10. If you put in the 397, you're either going to get the 10 or the -10 as your answer. It still will undo it, but in this case, this is not a function because it doesn't produce just one answer. So our process is when you have a function, is to, first of all, to find the inverse, put it into y equals form, swap the x and the y in their places, and then solve for y, and you'll get the rule that is now the inverse.